All right, let's keep working now. We are in Paradise Lost, book number 10. The Son as Servant at line 212 we have just seen. At line 225 now the Son will ascend back to heaven. And then immediately at line 230, meanwhile we have sin and death ready to begin an exchange that ultimately will lead to them coming. Of course, at line 244, where the wings are growing. We're back to this notion from the invocation of the Muse in book 1, the wings, the audacious wings. At line 255, we've got the adventurous work that sin and death are about to perform, creating their highway to hell. And then at line 273, we've got the smell of death. If Highway to Hell, the AC/DC song comes to mind, then the old song as well, Smell That Smell, Leonard Skinner, the smell of death. By the way, we should point out that this notion of the smell of death and carrion when all the bodies are dying. Notice we had a war in heaven, right, in book 5 and 6 of Paradise Lost, but we didn't have any death. We don't have any of that kind of thing. We'll get to death in a bit. The line 305, we have the easy, the smooth, the easy, the inoffensive road to hell, reminding us, of course, of Christ's comments in Matthew about the way to hell is wide and easy, the gate to heaven, not so much that way. At line 354, we have sin speaking to Satan. "O parent, these are magnific deeds, thy trophies, which thou viewest as not thine own. Thou art their author and prime architect." In other words, the complimenting and the flattering will start to begin. At line 364, we have Milton's unholy trinity of Satan and, of course, sin and death. 368, Satan is called the great liberator. You achieved our liberty, way to go. And at line 372, Satan will tell them, "Thine now is all this world. The world is yours. Go and jack it up. I've done my part. You do your part. Here we go." And by line 460, Satan is back at home, and I'm sorry, I want to back up just to line 409, just for a second. Right before Satan leaves to go back to hell to celebrate his great and magnificent feat, he will say, "Go, the affairs of hell, no detriment need fear." Line 409, "Go and be strong." There's some dark irony here. Deuteronomy 31, 7 and 8 is quoted, referred to here. But I'm also thinking about the end of book number 8 of Paradise Lost, where Raphael will say to Adam and Eve, "Be strong, live happy, and love." So you've got this, I mean, Milton loves to do this kind of stuff where he kind of makes references to other parts of his poem, and an astute reader is going to pick that up and say, oh, in the same way that Raphael was saying that to Adam and to Eve, now you're going to have Satan saying this to sin and death, his own progeny. It's a fascinating way to study, right? At 460, after a few lines, Satan is back at home in hell in pandemonium. "Thrones, dominions, princedoms, virtues, powers, for in possession such not only of right I call ye, and declare ye now returned, successful beyond hope to lead you forth. Now possesses lords," a few lines later, "a spacious world." He points out at line 487 that he was able to accomplish everything with an apple. And in fact, he says it's worth laughing about that it was so simple to be able to bring everything down with an apple. And of course, we'll pause here and say three things. One, of course, no apple is mentioned in the Genesis 3 account. Milton will say it's an apple. And from that moment on in Paradise Lost, when he says it's an apple, apples will take on a very interesting kind of symbolic value and power in texts. I think I already mentioned before, there's that scene, of course, in Disney's, one of those very early films Disney made, right, of Snow White, where the apple is shown. It's a beautiful red apple. I'm thinking of J.D. Salinger's short story Teddy that we've studied together, and what, of course, Teddy has to say about the apple. And, of course, you can't go without saying that the apple is a symbol in technologies of any number of kinds, isn't it, right? So we'll have to say that out loud as well. At line 500, as Satan is talking about what he's done, he mentions and alludes again to the Genesis 3:15 passage about being bruised. He says a little bruise is definitely worth it. And then we have this powerful moment at lines 504. As soon as he finishes, Satan expects to hear all kinds of applauding, but instead, watch this one. Now, we talked about this when we talked about Dante, right? The contrapasso. The contrapasso means that the punishment fits the crime, right? So notice and watch what happens. This is brilliant on Milton's part. So, having said a while, Satan, he stood expecting their universal shout and high applause to fill his ear. When, contrary, he hears on all sides from innumerable tongues a dismal, universal hiss, the sound of public scorn. Notice all the hard S sibilants. He wondered, but not long had leisure, wondering at himself no more. His visage drawn, he felt too sharp and spare. His arms clung to his ribs, his legs entwining each other, till, supplanted, down he fell, a monstrous serpent on his belly prone, reluctant but in vain. A greater power now ruled him, punished in the shape he sinned, according to his doom. In other words, Satan will use the serpent to fool fool Eve, and so the punishment will be that he has turned into a serpent along with all the demonic angels. He would have spoke, but hiss for hiss returned with forked tongue to forked tongue. For now we're all transformed alike to serpents, all as accessories to his bold riot. Dreadful was the din of hissing through the hall, thick swarming now with complicated monsters, head and tail. We think of that scene from the old Indiana Jones film, that pit where all those snakes are when they're down in Egypt looking for the Ark of the Covenant. It's a compelling moment. Of course, let's just point out, with this moment of the contrapassio, that is to say, the punishment will fit the crime, Milton is, of course, going to resurrect an inevitable question for us. Wait a minute. If Satan and the demonic angels could be punished in this way, then why is it that they can't be punished in this way as soon as they've fallen out of hell, and therefore Adam and Eve do not have to forego and have to deal with the temptation? Of course, Milton's argument will be simple. Again, his theodicy is that man and woman had to be free to choose, and the temptation, therefore, from Satan had to be allowed by God. At lines 550, we've got the continuation of this, because like Tantalus in that story of the Greeks, where he's never quite able to get that, a drink or to get that fruit, you've got this tree that looks beautiful, and the serpents will crawl up it, desperately wanting to eat something. They're dying of thirst, and the minute they bite into the apple, it turns into ash. Again, as I said, you never hear the phrase, an ash tree, the same way again. All right, let's go quickly now through the next part of the poem. 585, sin and death. They basically jack everything. Line 616, God sees these things, talks about the dogs of hell, the hellhounds, at line 630, and says, with one sling of thy virtuous arm, speaking to his son, well-pleasing son, both sin and death in yawning grave at last through chaos hurled obstruct the mouth of hell, forever and seal up his ravenous jaws. Then heaven and earth renewed shall be made pure to sanctity that shall receive no strain. Till then the curse pronounced on both proceeds. In other words, God says through Milton to the Son, I'm not worried about all of this, because in the end you are going to take care of everything. And again, the notion here is till one greater man, remember the opening lines of Paradise Lost Book 1, returns to us the blissful seed, right? Of course, Jesus Christ. At line 641, we have a song, a hymn of justice, which is again, just are thy ways, righteous are thy decrees on all thy works, who can extenuate thee? And of course, Milton is continuing to make the argument that there are reasons why terrible things happen in the world, and it all comes down to Adam and Eve eating of the forbidden fruit. Don't blame God, blame them. At line 666, bad weather and the winds are going to be explained. Before this, of course, you have no problems with that. We think of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, of course, and the way in which he writes his tribute to the winds. At line 678, we have the seasons, the change of the seasons, whereas before it was always perpetual spring in Eden. Now, of course, it's going to sometimes be nasty. We've got the pinching cold and the scorching heat that will be mentioned. And then at line 706, we've got war that's mentioned, the introduction of discord, daughter of sin, among the irrational death introduced, though fiercely antipathy. Of course, we had war, right, didn't we, in heaven, but that's a different understanding of war. We finish. And at line 714 now. So in other words, this is Milton's way to say, the reason why you got tornadoes and hurricanes and terrible things that happen, tsunamis and all of that happens because after Adam ate from the forbidden fruit along with Eve, the earth groaned, and the punishment is that the world was kind of set off of its axis in some ways. It almost seems to be the case. And then we are going to have all of the terrible things that happen in regards to the elements and all of that. The rest of Book 10 is really now the most fascinating part of Book 10, and for my money is some of the most amazing reading I have ever enjoyed. We have Adam at line 714. Adam sees paradise destroyed, and he immediately is aware, in the same way that when he awoke, looked at himself and immediately knew he didn't create himself, didn't design himself, there must be a designer, there must be a creator, and immediately was ready to genuflect and pay homage. Now he sees, but a different kind of seeing. This is like Oedipus's insight. Of course, it's a tragic insight, taking us back to Book 9, right? Which Adam saw already in part, though hid in gloomiest shade, to sorrow abandoned, for worse felt within, and in a troubled sea of passion tossed, thus to this burden sought with sad complaint. And now we will begin at roughly line 718, 719, 720. The soliloquy of Adam. Now, let's say a couple of things about this right away. Let's say three things. One, I can't help but read these lines, and I really do want to work with you now line by line. I know I haven't done this a lot through this book, but I want to do this with you here because you cannot help but read this and be blown away by the fact that there's major resonances to the Hamlet to be or not to be speech that we have, of course, studied together elsewhere. Number two, we have said that Paradise Lost is a political text, among other things. It is a text of the epic, it's a text of philosophic and theological import, and it's a text of politics. All three of those are going to come full here in this passage now, where Adam begins to speak out loud and ostensibly will say, "What have I done?" And in the process, we have the tortured psyche that, of course, Freud will make quite famous as well. Let's just work through this and pay attention to all of the major implications that are going on. Of course, as an epic, we have a major speech here, no question. As a work of philosophy, theology, the theodictic question is going to get looked at from multiple perspectives. For example, Adam's going to ask, did I ask to be created? Then how do you account for this as freedom then? Fascinating, fascinating. And then finally, of course, Adam as independent mind, psyche, and then of course, here in a bit, he will have a comment or two for fair Eve, right? Oh, miserable of happy. Is this the end of this new glorious world? And me, so late, the glory of that glory, who now become accursed of blessed? Hide me from the face of God, whom to behold was then my height. of happiness. Let's just pause, of course, in the Psalms. For those of you that read the Psalms out of the Bible, you know this notion of being hidden from the face of God sounds familiar. Yet, well, if here would end the misery, I wish I was dead. I deserved it and would bear my own deservings. In other words, I deserve to be dead. But this will not serve. All that I eat or drink or shall beget is propagated curse. In other words, it hits him that even if he were to be able to bear the punishment, there's, O voice, once heard delightfully, increase and multiply. Now death to hear. In other words, he was reminded, oh yeah, I'm supposed to increase and multiply. In other words, I'm the father of the human race, and everyone that comes after me will carry with me what St. Augustine called original sin. To point out, Genesis 3 doesn't use the word sin or fall, and certainly not the term original sin, and yet this will be the understanding. He says it, now death to hear. For what can I increase or multiply but curses on my head? Who of all ages to succeed, but feeling the evil on him brought by me will curse my head? In other words, he says, every time bad stuff happens from here on out, I'm going to get blamed for it. I'll ill fare our ancestor impure. He imagines people saying, for this we may thank Adam, but his thanks shall be the excretion. So besides mine own that bid upon me, all from me shall with a fierce reflux on me redound on me as on their natural center light, heavy though in their place. He says it, oh fleeting joys of paradise, dear brought with lasting woes. In other words, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Everything is gone. And then a thought. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I ask to be made by you, God? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me, or here place in this delicious garden? Of course, when he was created, he jumped up and immediately knew that he didn't create himself, and therefore there must be a designer. Now, however, he's asking about the reason. Why was I created in the first place? By the way, for those of you that have read the book of Job, some of his lamentations here will sound very familiar, right? As my will concurred, he says, did I solicit thee from darkness to promote thee, or here place in this delicious garden? As my will concurred not to my being, it were but right and equal to reduce me to my dust, desirous to resign and render back all I received, unable to perform thy terms, too hard by which I was to hold the good I sought not, to the loss of that sufficient penalty. Why hast thou added the sense of endless woes? In other words, he says it. Being born, that's rough. Being born and causing all of the future race of humankind to have pain, suffering, that's even worse. But to live knowing that, he calls it inexplicable thy justice seems. It's an important line because, of course, it raises the question of Milton's Theodicy. Is it fair that God would create Adam and Eve and then they get to live with this terrible condition? Yet, he continues, to say truth too late, I thus contest. Then should have been refused those terms, whatever, when they were proposed. Thou didst accept them. Wilt thou enjoy the good, then cavil the conditions? In other words, he's speaking to himself. And he says, yeah, where was all this complaining back when you were living in Eden and it was an amazing time in your life? And, though God made thee without thy leave, what if thy son proved disobedient and reproved? Retort, wherefore didst thou beget me? In other words, he kind of starts to see the picture here unfolding. When things go bad for my sons, of course, we immediately think of Cain and Abel, don't we? Which is ultimately going to end with that first terrible murder, right? He says, one of my sons is going to ask, hey, why did you create me? If you knew all of this, doesn't make it right. I sought it not. Wouldst thou admit for his contempt of thee that proud excuse? Yet him not thy election, but natural necessity begot. God made thee of choice his own, and of his own to serve him. Thy reward was his grace. Thy punishment then justly is at his will. We're back to Milton's again, attempt to justify the ways of God to men. Be it so, for I submit. His doom is fair, that durst I am, and shall to dust return. oh, welcome hour, whenever. And in other words, he says it. I'm aware now that I'm gonna go back to the dust. I'm walking dirt. I go back to the dirt. I'm ready for it to happen whenever. Why delays his hand to execute what his decree fixed on this day? Notice all of the amazing questions of this soliloquy. He says it. Why doesn't God just kill me now? Why do I overlive? Why am I mocked with death and lengthened out to deathless pain? How gladly would I meet mortality, my sentence, and be earth insensible? How glad would lay me down as in my mother's lap. There I should rest and sleep secure. This will, of course, remind us of Hamlet. To sleep, he says, it's a consummation devoutly to be wished. If I could just go to sleep, die, just go to sleep, I would be fine. His dreadful voice no more would thunder in my ears. No fear of worse to me and to my offspring would torment me with cruel expectation. Yet, one doubt pursues me still, lest all I cannot die, lest that pure breath of life, the spirit of man which God inspired, cannot together perish with this corporal clod. And then it hits him. Wait a minute. The dualistic view of humans is there's body, but then there's this thing called spirit. Spirit, mind, soul, consciousness, energy, whatever you want to call it. And he says, that can't be destroyed. So, oh no, what do I do? Then, in the grave, or in some other dismal place, who knows, but I shall die a living death. In other words, I'm not actually dead. Oh, thought, horrid if true. Yet why? Again, we come back to the question of why. It was but breath of life that sinned. What dies but what had life and sin? The body properly hath neither. All of me then shall die. Let this appease the doubt, since human reach no further knows. In other words, he says, I really don't know what's going to happen after I die. For though the Lord of all be infinite, is his wrath also? And now here comes the next question. Okay, so I screwed up. By the way, let's point out to this point, no we screwed up. This is all Adam. Taking it on himself, he's saying it. I screwed up. And yet, now the question is it fair to punish forever one act? How fair is that? Be it